The desert night bled into dawn like a dying ember struggling to become flame. And Jacob Rourke, a poor rancher with dust for fortune and scars for memories, awoke to the sound of wind scraping against his weather-beaten cabin, the boards rattling like bones in an old coffin, reminding him once again that everything he owned could be swept away in a single gust. He rolled out of his cot, his boots hitting the floorboards, the cool air of the Arizona frontier biting his lungs as he stepped outside, clutching his battered hat, scanning the horizon like a man hunted all his life, because in truth he was once a cavalry scout in the Apache Wars, now an outcast who refused to tell the whole story of why he walked away, why he vanished from the regiment and carved a life here on barren land, raising stray cattle, patching fences, and burying the guilt that clawed at him every night. The sun crawled over the jagged mountains, casting gold across the valley, revealing his meager herd of thin cattle grazing near the dry creek, and he muttered quietly, still alive, better than most, but his chest tightened with dread. 3 weeks of drought had pushed his animals to starvation, and the local townsfolk had made it clear that a man like him was a mistake that needed correcting, especially when rumors returned of his past and whispered accusations: deserter, traitor, coward, and worst of all, Apache lover. That last insult cut deeper than anything, because they had no idea what he had seen, the things he had witnessed when soldiers burned villages, and he, too young to understand honor, raised a rifle and obeyed. That was 20 years ago, long before he disappeared, long before he decided that the blood on his hands was not something he could wash away in whiskey or prayer, but something he could only face by living differently, by refusing to let anyone die on his land again, no matter who they were, enemy or friend. So when dawn was still half dark and the smell of dust rode the wind, he noticed movement at the far end of the pasture. Two figures, wobbling like mirages, leaning on each other, staggering toward his ranch gate, and Jacob narrowed his eyes, hand instinctively drifting to the revolver at his hip. But he resisted, forcing his hand down, because he had sworn to himself that the gun was only for animals and predators, never again for people. As the first rays sharpened the land, he recognized the shapes: not cowboys, not settlers, but Apaches, worn and wounded, one of them clutching his side and the other barely standing. Jacob stepped forward and called out in a low voice, "You're a long way from your people," but they didn't understand his tongue. Their lips cracked from thirst, and they collapsed before him like spent horses. He knelt quickly, turning one over, seeing the arrow still lodged in the man's side. The shaft snapped, but the head driven deep, and the other, a boy hardly 20, was burnt from the sun and fever, lips trembling as he tried to speak in broken English. "Help, big danger, chasing us." Jacob swallowed his fear. He knew these lands, knew who hunted here: bounty hunters, vigilantes, the kind of men who believed that Apache scalps were worth more than Apache lives. Without hesitation, he hauled the older man toward his cabin, shoulders aching, the boy limping behind, and he cursed it under his breath as he remembered how long it had been since he'd patched someone back together. Inside the cabin, he tore strips from an old saddle blanket, heating water, burning through supplies he could barely afford. And all the while the boy watched him with sharp eyes, not trusting, ready to spring like a cornered fox. Yet Jacob didn't explain himself. He simply worked, removing the arrow, pressing whiskey-soaked cloth to the wound, stitching with trembling hands. And as dawn finally settled into full morning, the older Apache breathed shallow but steady. Alive, not safe yet, but alive. Jacob poured a cup of water for the boy, who drank like it was life itself. And when he regained enough breath, he said, "They kill our family, chase us all night. They come soon." And Jacob asked, throat dry, "How many?" But the boy's eyes dropped to his trembling hands, and he whispered, "White men, maybe 12, maybe more." And Jacob felt the dread, the old anger, the memories of war scraping at his ribs like rusted nails. Yet he didn't hesitate, only reached for his old Winchester that hung above the hearth, wiped dust from the barrel, loaded 6 rounds, then strapped it to his saddle, and tied the door shut behind him as if protecting the wounded man inside was the only law that mattered. He mounted his horse, a tired Mare named Sage, and rode to the ridge where he'd built a crude lookout. And there he waited, heart pounding like a drum, sun climbing higher, sweat soaking his shirt. Then he saw the riders coming. 12 at first, then 14, armed with rifles, faces masked in greed and hate, and at their head was none other than Captain Harrow, the man Jacob had once served under, now a bounty hunter with a badge pinned for his own glory, a man who believed he could tame the frontier by force. Harrow spotted Jacob immediately, pulling his horse to a stop, sneer spreading across his leathered face, and called out, "Well, I'll be damned if it isn't the ghost of our battalion." And Jacob didn't respond, only sat tall in his saddle, Winchester laid across his lap like a dead promise, and Harrow continued, "We're looking for two redskins. They shot a farmer's boy in Tucson. You seen anything?" Jacob forced his jaw not to tremble, because he knew how this game worked. Lies, blame. The settlers accusing the tribes for every crime, every missing cow, every fire, no matter who was truly responsible. And he said, "I've seen no one. Just my cattle and the empty sky." Harrow grinned, pulling his reins, his men fanning out like wolves, and Jacob saw the hate in their eyes. Not lawmen, not deputies, just killers with badges. Harrow leaned forward and said, "You've always been soft, Rourke. You left the fight when it was time to wipe them out. Always wondered why, figured maybe you broke." And Jacob whispered, voice cold as steel, "I didn't break." "You did." And Harrow's smile faded, replaced by the look of a man who had already made up his mind. The moment hung between them like a razor's edge, and Jacob knew they would come in full force. They would search his cabin. They would drag those young Apaches out and butcher them. And he knew he alone stood between survival and massacre. So he fired not at Harrow but into the ground, dust erupting, wings of the bullet throwing horses off balance. And in that moment of confusion he wheeled his Mari around, bolting downhill, forcing them to chase him instead of the cabin. His heart hammered like war drums as Sage tore across the rocky valley, hooves pounding the earth, bullets snapping past them like angry hornets. Jacob firing backward without aim, just buying seconds, buying distance, until finally he reached the cliff edge where the world seemed to drop to nothing but wind and canyon. He leapt from the saddle and slapped Sage's flank, sending her sprinting away, then rolled behind a boulder as Harrow's men came roaring over the rise, shooting wild. And Jacob took one breath, then another, remembering the Apache elder he'd met years ago, the one he could never forget, the one who said, "A coward kills because he fears death. A warrior kills because he cares who lives." And Jacob steadied his rifle and fired. One rider fell, then another, and the rest spread, firing back, bullets chewing the stone around him. His hat flew into the canyon, and he cursed as the volley grew louder. But he didn't run, he fought, firing, reloading, crawling to new cover, feeling his ribs burn as a glancing shot grazed him, until finally Harrow shouted, "Enough," and the gunfire paused like a breath before a storm. Harrow walked toward him, pistol drawn, stepping over his fallen men, and Jacob rose from behind the boulder, Winchester empty, body shaking, blood running down his arm. And Harrow laughed. "You protected them? You protected the devils that murdered your brothers?" And Jacob barked back, "You murdered them. We murdered them. And you called it justice." And Harrow lunged forward, firing point blank. But in that moment the air screamed the war cry of the Chiricahua. Apaches erupted across the valley like thunder ripping open the sky, and over the distant hills came a sight no man living would forget. 1,000 riders, 1,000 warriors, 1,000 arrows glinting in the rising sun, charging with the fury of generations, their horses a tidal wave of dust and vengeance, their faces painted with the ghosts of their ancestors, their hearts burning with the memory of every child, every mother, every elder slain in the name of conquest. Harrow turned, stunned, paling like a ghost, as the Apache army swept down on him, a living storm, and in that instant Jacob dropped to his knees, his eyes filled with awe, because he recognized their leader, the older Apache man he had saved hours before, now mounted and roaring with strength reborn, lifted by the will of his people. Harrow tried to run, but the thunder swallowed him, and when the dust settled the bounty hunters were no more, scattered like broken bones in the sand. The Apaches surrounded Jacob, weapons raised, but the elder dismounted, stepping forward slowly, eyes sharp as flint, and placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder, speaking in a voice carved from stone and fire, "One life given, One debt repaid, our people remember, and the warriors lowered their bows, forming a circle of respect around the lone rancher. He stood trembling, breath ragged, ribs bruised, clothes torn, but alive, and when the sun broke fully over the mountains, gilding the battered landscape with gold, Jacob understood that kindness was not weakness. It was the only weapon left in a world built on cruelty. From that dawn on, people whispered a new tale across every saloon and town square. The poor rancher who saved one Apache life, and in return 1,000 came to protect him. 1,000 to say that honor still lived in the West. And if you're hearing this story now, remember that loyalty is born from courage. Compassion has more power than bullets, and the world always remembers those who stand between the innocent and the men who hunt them. So if you want more stories of the Wild West, of the forgotten heroes and the lost legends, subscribe to the channel, join our campfire, and ride with us into the next tale, because there are still countless stories waiting to be told, and your support keeps them alive.